Executive Director of Global Santa Fe for the last 7 months. For those of you who may know us as the Council on International Relations, we changed our name and brand in spring when we celebrated our annual gala with Ambassador Vicki Huddleston. I think some of you were there. It was a wonderful event. We're pleased to have with us this evening Global Santa Fe's President, Mark Acequia, Ambassador Mark Acequia, and his wife, Jane. And we have several other board members here, and we welcome them. I would like to also, now that it's quiet, I didn't want to announce and introduce Benedicte. Everyone already knows her. That's what I have learned. Valentiner, and of course Vicki Huddleston. Ambassador Vicki Huddleston is a former Global Santa Fe board member, and we're very pleased that she can be here to facilitate this conversation, which will be starting in just a moment. But before I do, I did want to let you know that many of you are already receiving Global Santa Fe's email digest. That's where we share the lineup of many exciting programs under our Dialogue and Diplomacy pillar. We are going to be launching our Democracy Under Fire series. Yes, I know, and we're very excited. It'll run through 2022 and 2023.
Excited and terrified.
Excited and terrified. Democracy Under Fire. It's building on our Journalism Under Fire series. So it's a continuation, and there will be a journalism component to that series. But we'll be launching it in mid-November. Many of you probably already saw that we'll be hosting veteran journalist Peter Baker and Susan Glasser and their new book, Trump the Great Divider. We also have a historian, Jeremy Suri, who is going to be fascinating to provide context for the times in which we live, pulling history forward. We'll have an event with the Collected Works bookstore and an event like this as well. And I do want to also pitch our Judge Chuck Case lecture. Professor Harold Coe will be joining us at the end of the month in Las Campanas. He is, well, he's very well known, but for me, I knew him, came across his name when he represented Ukraine in Ukraine versus Russia at the International Court of Council of Justice, or Court of Justice, yes. At any rate, he will be someone you will not want to miss as well. So I have to give my little commercial there, because to the extent that you can share the information with your friends, what we are learning is that most of our events are sold out, and I wanted to be sure that members and those of you who are attending tonight have that chance. We'll be sharing the links, and also you can typically find our ads in the Pasatiempo. We usually put out an announcement of 2, 3, 4 speakers in advance. You can always call the office or email me. We'd love to hear from you. I want to thank Pilar and our volunteers, Susan, Jane, and others for helping us put this event together. It's a beautiful setting, Acequia Madre House. It's got its own history, and I wish we had time to go into it, but unfortunately we do not. But it's just one more example of all that Santa Fe offers, and to be able to be outside together was truly a benefit. So I'm not going to spend more time talking. I'm going to be turning it over, but I have to tell you that Benedicte told me that when she first returned to Santa Fe 21 years ago, Ambassador Frank Ortiz, sorry, I have the German in my head. Frank Ortiz gave her a tour of Acequia Madre House and wanted her to run it as some kind of entertainment facility. This is no joke. An entertainment facility for the mayor of Santa Fe, which she, of course, did not do. But I said, well, who could blame him? I mean, to have someone like you come back and to want to have him run it. Well, there's nothing, I believe, that Benedicte could not do. That is one thing. And I really do want to thank you, Ambassador Huddleston, for facilitating the conversation. And I have this book at home, and I am not going to say more about it, but I do encourage you, if you don't have a copy, you can buy one outside or afterwards, and I bet Benedicte would be happy to sign it, inscribe it, and I think it makes a great a gift as well. My 90-year-old mother got it. She's Swedish and just thinks you walk on water. She couldn't join us, but I do want you to know that we do have copies here. So I'm going to hand the microphone to you, but I'm going to first let Ambassador Huddleston launch our conversation. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll be back after our program.
Hey everybody, lovely to see you in such a wonderful place. And thank you, Lisa, thank you, Mark, thank you, Susan, for putting this together in such a lovely place. It really makes it special, and it's really special to interview you, Benedicte. And you know what they called her in the book? If you read the book, they called her Mrs. V. So we're going to call her Mrs. V this evening.
Or the Iron Lady.
I can definitely see that from reading the book.
There was one group, I think, was it Korea or one of the African groups that called me that because I sort of had to put down some guidelines what to do. Anyway, it was only one group.
It was undoubtedly President Ayadema of Togo who came with 10 big trunks stuffed with smoked monkey.
I thought that my very black, wonderful houseman, he went white as a sheet. There was a smoked monkey lying looking at him, and when he pulled it aside, there was an iguana, a giant iguana, that reached from my fingertip to my shoulder. And under that there was something else, I've forgotten, it was so disgusting. And anyway, that was the food they were eating. And the chefs in Togo had thought that the poor president wouldn't be fed in foreign parts. So they had to send their own food with them. And of course, I don't know how it went past our customs officers, but it did. And I will say I was not going to be the one who went down in history as ruining American agriculture by letting the garbage go out on our trucks. So I called the Department of Agriculture, and they understood the problem immediately. And they said, well, if you will contain the garbage at Blair House, you can serve the food while they are there, and then you have to collect it for us, and we will come and get it. Yeah. And that's a cold other story, because that was a problem with the president who wanted his food and wasn't used to going without a smoked monkey for breakfast. So,
and he wasn't used to going without champagne for breakfast as well.
And you had that your own experience with him, champagne from morning to night.
He was quite a old line dictator, and I went in to meet with him in Togo, and it was just so typical. So I walked in, and he said, "You sit here." And so I sit down, and the couch slammed to the floor. And of course, he's up here in his chair like And then, of course, the champagne comes immediately. You know, here's your champagne, here's your champagne. So I do this one.
But I remember the more upsetting African visit was from Zaire, Mobutu. And he traveled with his treasury. I swear to you, he had all his investments, whether it was money or papers, probably the stock market in New York and the stock exchange in London and so on. It came with him because, of course, it's very smart. That's one way you are sure nobody tries to take over your country in the meantime. And so he traveled with this, and there were two little men, and I call them little men because they were so scared and so on, and they were on duty all the time. They were not allowed to leave this room where all this had been installed, and we felt so sorry for them. So of course we brought food up on trays and made sure that they at least got fed on the way. And he also was the most brutal. He was disgusting. His tiny little pockmarked foreign minister was delightful with a gorgeous English wife, and apparently Mobutu had personally visited the foreign minister when he had imprisoned him and beaten him. Always took part. And of course that's one way of making him do as you want. So he traveled with him, and I remember every time the president would come back from running around town and doing his thing, and would always shake my hands and say, "Oh, ça va bien, madame, ça va bien." And I remember I would go to the nearest bathroom and scrub my hands. I just couldn't sort of handle that. But it was not the worst of anything. It's not a complaint. It was fascinating. It was interesting. It was new experiences. We learned so much. The whole staff were on board with how weird it was, the whole thing, and just we sort of had several mottos. One was grin and bear it, because this too shall pass. And that was sort of the thing, yeah.
Can you hold the mic closer to your mouth?
Closer, you can't hear in the back?
In the back.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So here's the thing, Benedicte. I know you liked H.W. Bush a lot, and I have to say I think he was a pretty good foreign policy president. H.W. Bush. Oh, President Bush.
I love
exactly.
Yeah.
So when I was reading your book, here we are. We have Ayadema, dictator of Togo. We have Mobutu Sese Seko, dictator of Congo. We have Denis Sassou Nguesso, dictator of Little Congo, and Robert Mugabe, dictator of Zaire. And these were state visits. State visits, are for our allies or someone we're trying to persuade to do something we want. These are really a big deal. You get to stay in this beautiful house, be pampered night and day by Mrs. V and her entire staff. Why did H.W. invite all these African dictators?
Well, you remember, I've forgotten who it was, a British statesman in the 19th century, who said, "You have no allies, you have no enemies, you only have national interest." I'm sort of playing around with this quote, and I think that's what it is. You needed these allies, and in whichever shape or form they came, they would support American interest, and therefore, of course, they were recipients of lots of money, lots of our money, but perhaps they stabilized the regions, and that is my view on it. What about you?
Oh, you shouldn't. I was just going to say, that was very diplomatic. But for sure, Togo wasn't doing anything for anybody.
Togo was an anomaly because of all my 200 visits, it's the only one I feel I lost control over. And when I talk about control, what we did at Blair House was mechanical diplomacy. We provided the environment. We were very often, most often, the first American faces that all of these people saw. They would arrive at the airport, at Andrews Air Force Base. They would come in, some of them would meet the chief of protocol and a protocol officer. The rest of them, the valet, the security guard and so on, had never met Americans. We were the face at that time of our nation, I think. And therefore, we made it our mission that while we cannot do anything about policy and politics in the White House, we have no influence on that, we can and we must spoil everybody, from the highest to the lowest of them, feed them well, give them good beds to sleep in, do all the little services they wanted. We had no problems at Blair House, we had solutions. And we wanted them, our mission was, when they go home to their villages around the world, they will say America is wonderful. And that, I feel, was our contribution to our foreign policy objectives.
So I want to go back a little bit, because I think, you know, you say in your book when you were working on getting this job that people would kill for it. And for sure, people would kill for it. I mean, you're meeting emperors, kings, queens, princesses, the powerful and the mighty. And so you got the job, and I was wondering, first of all, how you really managed to get this job, such a plum. On the other hand, for me, it would be the worst job in the world. You were there 13 years because you were so diplomatic. I would have been out of there 13 days.
I doubt you would, because the house takes over. Yeah. And I saw that with my staff when we hired them, and we sort of formed this working relationship that was in a way astounding to me. I was, of course, primus inter pares, but I was working, I came from Senator Domenich's office where I had been for 7 years, working with college students. Here I was working with grown-ups, with professionals who had really learned their craft around town and elsewhere in the country. And so I had the greatest respect for them, and I gave them very enormous long leashes to do what they could, because they were the experts. And we would consult in the morning. We had a staff meeting at 8 o'clock. If it wasn't a visit, then we had no time for staff meetings. But we would in the morning go over the program and so on, and each person would come up and say, this is what I do, this is what I do, and so on. And we just I just let them go with it. How can I put it, what the house does to you? It's 4 old houses and a new building that was added on. In the 6 years it was closed up. I came on board at the tail end of that. So Ronald Reagan only had the use of the house the last 9 months of his presidency. And the first months of his presidency, he had all kinds of disasters at Blair House. Among them, and I love this one, the chandelier fell into the bed of the King of Morocco. Fortunately, the king was not in the bed. But he said,
who was it who said that?
That's very unheard of. But it sent a strong message to the government that something had to be done. And the house closed, and lots of money was raised on private hands, which was wonderful. And I remember about this chandelier, of course, some years later, we were planning the state visit of the Tunisian president, Ben Ali. And that was in Papa Bush's time. And there's always advanced teams coming to plan out everything with the White House and with State Department and with Blair House and perhaps with the US Congress, so that there would be a joint session or something like that. And I had this, the chief of protocol and the head of Ben Ali's staff had come, and I walked them through the house, and I told them, I showed them the chandelier. That particular room that used to be the primary bedroom had been turned into a sitting room while a new building had been built. And I showed them the chandelier, and I said, what had closed the house, the chandelier fell into the bed of the King of Morocco, and they were horrified. And they said, oh my God, was the king in the bed? And I said, looking sort of appropriately somber? I said, no, fortunately not. And they looked at each other and they said, what a pity. all those little things that happened made it all worthwhile. And 13 days a week, it wouldn't have been enough to have discovered all these wonderful things that happened.
Well, speaking of royalty, I remember in the book you say royalty is not like you and me. You know, they're special. There's something different in it. And so I wanted, you said you mentioned the King of Morocco, who was like the visit from hell, right?
The visit from hell, yes.
And then you also had, and I saw him up here, the Emperor and Empress of Japan, which is the longest dynasty, is that not correct? They have Elizabeth B. or King Charles now. But, you know, why do you have someone like the Emperor of Japan who has this great character and makes a lovely visit, and then you have this King of Morocco, the visit from hell?
I would say the young king. We had the old king. I avoided to have him stay overnight. He took over half of the Willard Hotel, and he was offered Blair House for his meetings, because at the time my least favorite chief of protocol, he's dead now so I can say nasty things about him, and called Joseph Werner Reed, he had very good instincts with people, and he knew that having the King of Morocco at Blair House would not do, because he had found too many people. They would sleep on the floors, they would do horrible things to us. So he suggested they go to the Willard Hotel, and he was able to arrange that, and that worked fine. And so the old king came over for visits, and he was very pleasant, and I was very nice to me, and talked a lot with me and so on. Then his son came, and the son actually was very nice, was trying to do, to modernize the nation, I think. And he came, he was unmarried the first time he came, and his sister, princess, came and acted as his hostess. Now the visit from hell meant that his uncle, who was in New York, do you remember Mark? He was in New York with United Nations, I think, and he organized the visit, and he had learned, because we didn't have the old king, that our problem was we could only have one overnight visitor per bed in the house. So he would not give us a rooming list. And the mantra was, the king will decide when he comes. And of course we had maybe 50 people sleeping on floors. I could do nothing about it. Wow. What I could do was to give them blankets and pillows and protect our furniture if they threw themselves on the silk furniture in the living room. That was all I could do. That was one hellish part of this. Wow. The other hellish part was that the children of the princess, the 13-year-old boy, spray painted wherever he felt like it, and nobody could stop him. And he also used a water pistol, and so there was water on this side, everywhere. And then my favorite one was actually his niece was 15 years old, and when she entered the airplane in Rabat to go with her uncle to Washington, she had been a typical Moroccan girl with black hair. When she arrived in Washington, she had blonde hair, and she had dyed her hair on the way. And the king had a royal fit, and he prevented her from being seen by anybody. And our hairdresser spent 4 hours up in the hair salon, hobnobbing with the king, who popped up every half hour to check on her, and trying to get the dye out of the princess' hair. So he had a ball, of course, but that was part of it. And then 2 little dogs came, and of course nobody looked after the dogs, and they kind of did their thing wherever. And I have one description in the book where I came into the big garden room, the addition we have, and I saw this little mop on the floor, and I was just about to whack it, you know, when it turned out to be the miniature Yorkie that belonged to the king. And it was called Godzilla. And anyway, and by that time I was kind of annoyed, so a little bit annoyed, you know. And the woman who was in charge of this little mop on wheels or on legs, I said to her, he did a big thing on the floor, and I said, I gave her paper towels, and I said, nettoyez s'il vous plaît. She had never heard something like that in her life, because there was always somebody under her who would do that. The caste system was unbelievable. So yes, it was the visit from hell. But I think we have good relations with Morocco, don't we? Yes.
Morocco was the first country to recognize the United States. So we go back a long, long time.
Yeah.
So we didn't ruin anything.
So, what about the emperor? Was he just so of Japan?
emperor,
Was he just too nice to have a good story about?
I loved the emperor and the empress. I really have to say so. It was one of my two favorite visits. The reason was, first and foremost, one had read about the strangeness in a way of the country, the way they live, they are isolated, things like that. But when they came, they were fluent in English. They looked you in the eye. She knew every name of the staff who waited on her. She would come to me if she had a problem. She wouldn't go through a layer of 3 or 4 people before I got the message that it was too hot, too cold, whatever it was. She came straight to me to talk to me about something. And I have a story I just sort of love here. They had arrived in the morning, and there was a little lunch to 7 people, our chief of protocol, and the ambassador, our ambassador to Japan, Walter Mondale, and his wife, and then the emperor and empress and his ambassador and wife, and they had lunch in the lead dining room. And I always sort of hovered out of sight completely, but in the neighborhood in case something happened where I had to step in. And suddenly the empress came dashing out of the dining room, through the lead drawing room, into the Blair drawing room, out into the garden, as if she was looking for something. And I went after her and I said, may I help you? What are you looking for, Your Majesty? Oh, she said, I'm looking for the silver tree. And I had to sort of think a bit fast here on my feet. I said, it must have been here before the renovation, because she and her husband, when they were Crown Prince of Japan, had visited President Eisenhower and stayed at Blair House. And they had left their small son back in Japan. So they were newly married, and she told me they had been at the window in her bedroom, looking out in the garden in moonlight, and they had seen the moon shining on a tree, and it looked like silver. And they had loved that so much that her husband had taken seeds from the tree when he left, brought it back to Japan and planted it in his garden in Tokyo. And that was the garden their son, the Crown Prince, now occupied. And I loved this little story, so I told my chief of protocol, she told Mrs. Clinton, who told the Washington Post. And then when they came to say goodbye, the Chancellor whom I had dealt with, we had a little talk, and I said, would it be possible to have seeds come back to Blair House from that tree?
Yeah.
And he, in typical Japanese fashion, would not make a decision. He just said he would see what he could do. Precisely 7 weeks later, he called. And after we had talked about the autumn colors down Virginia, down the Smoky Mountains and down Skyline Drive and so on, he came to the point. The emperor had taken a personal interest in this and had called in the head gardener, and they had decided that because they had many birch trees now growing in the garden, the only way they could guarantee it was out of that tree was to slice a piece off the tree. So a few months later we received, flown by Japanese Airlines, 3 little pieces that went to our arboretum, and a few months later we had a planting at Blair House of the grand tree of our original tree at Blair House. And there isn't a Japanese visitor who has been to Blair House who hasn't been out being photographed with that tree, with that photos. And I just loved that story that he took this interest himself.
Yes, that's lovely. It reminds me of the Return of the King.
Yes.
Yes, you know, the Lord of the Rings is renewed again. But what about Queen Elizabeth? I can't not ask about her. You know, we've seen this lovely state funeral and outpouring of sympathy and respect for her.
Yeah, I sort of published this article in the Post, in the New Mexican. I don't know if someone saw it, on the Queen. And I really don't have many more comments on her because it's not a person you got to know. There was no personal vibes or anything. There was a great deal of politeness, and when we said hello and goodbye, and that was it, because they simply don't chit-chat unless they have to chit-chat. Her staff was wonderful. They were old friends of mine. Some of them, they had been stationed in Washington when we were all young and carefree and so on. And it was so much fun to see them. And that made it much easier because I knew exactly what was expected. But there was no, it's not a personal thing. And you also had mentioned perhaps Queen Margrethe of Denmark, a little bit the same.
Your queen.
Yeah, my queen, yeah. And she is, she tells people that she's shy. I think if you've been on the throne for so long, the shyness should have gone by the, whatever, long time ago. But of course for me the Danish visit was very, very special. And I know that her personal assistant who had come, who was the sort of household master at home, who spoke no English, was beside himself that I could speak Danish with him and he could have a holiday because he didn't have to worry about anything. It was sort of all done for him.
Well, I'm going to ask you some meaty questions now. And that was, you loved Clinton. I thought that was very interesting because she was very fond of H.W. And Clinton turned you into a Democrat, right?
He did, yes, he did. I have to say that I loved Papa Bush and Jim Baker for what they did in foreign affairs, because they really presided, quote unquote, over how America would deal with the deconsolidation of the Soviet Union. And personally, because I'm European, that's a little bit my interest, and I thought they were absolutely brilliant. And they invited everybody who were around Russia, the satellite leaders and the Eastern European leaders. They invited them to come to Washington and to get them into the Western mindset. Bill Clinton continued that to a certain degree, and of course Bill Clinton, for us, the most exciting with Bill Clinton for me was the Middle East peace process that he worked so hard at. We had Mubarak of Egypt 9 times during those 2 years. a total of 45 nights I spent, now I won't say with Mubarak, but during, but I'm sorry, but during his visits, and because the security risk of Mubarak was so high, it was the highest in the world. Secret Service demanded that he stay most of the time at Blair House. Well, you can imagine what that did to Blair House and the staff and whatever we did. We had them morning, noon and night, and they smoked like chimney. And the security guards were very upset because we had no pornographic channels on television. So yes, I saw Bill Clinton, how much he worked, how he brought King Hussein and Prime Minister Rabin together to finish a 46-year enmity between the two countries, and that was signed at the White House, and they came over at Blair House and had lunch. And that was absolutely wonderful. It was like an explosion. They were so relieved. All this weight on their shoulders had come off them. And he also, of course, tried to get Arafat and Rabin together, and Perez, who after Rabin was assassinated, which was an incredible, horrible time and a horrible event. And then Perez came, and then we had that appalling specimen called Bibi Netanyahu. And we are now on Bibi. Is that all right with you? Now, Bibi, I will say, was my most unfavorite visitor. And it had to do also with the fact that he should have known better. There was no excuse for all the things he did and his arrogance, and he literally played our Congress like a violin. And I personally, I must say, cast a great deal of the blame of what happened to Rabin on his shoulders and people in this country who supported him with demonstrations, with money, with whatever it was. I really hated that. But the worst part, and that is serious, he stole our silver. We had every breakfast tray that went to the primary suite lacked 2 King's pattern from Tiffany silver teaspoons every single time. And at first, our head butler, Jose, was wonderful. He would count the silver every day and so on, and he couldn't understand this. And we thought, of course, the way one does, oh, the security have taken it, or maybe his bitchy wife, because he had a really bitchy wife. And nobody's taping this, I But the one constant in all these visits when the teaspoons disappeared was Bibi himself. Nobody else. They were all new people who came with him. So we knew where the fault was. And there was nothing I could do about it. I could, of course, wrote a memo to the chief of protocol. I was just told that he had a reputation for kleptomania. And even my suggestion to my head butler to put stainless steel spoons in that didn't go over very well, because my head butler drew himself up and said, "You don't do that, Mrs. Anyway, when I was lost at Blair House, which was, I think, the day of the earthquake in Washington, so I couldn't stay for very long. We were sent out in the Lafayette Square. I sat with Jose in the pantry, and I said, "Jose, how many times has Bibi been here since I left?" And he said, "Oh, Mrs. V, I don't remember, but let me go and count the silver."
That's a great story. Yeah. Yeah. So the other sort of questionable visitor that you've had was Boris Yeltsin.
Oh, boy, I like Boris Yeltsin. Who cannot like Boris Yeltsin? He came, he was the last overnight visitor during Papa Bush's administration. And then after that it was campaign and we had only parties and so on. And there he was absolutely charming, he was on top of the world, he was in good health, and really I liked him very much. He came back during the Clinton administration and he was a bit worse for wear because he had been, I think he was sick. He drank a lot, and he drank a lot because they brought over boxes from the embassy to augment what we served, you know, so they would never run out. And the first night, oh God, I'm so sorry I went early to bed, but the first night, about 1 o'clock in the morning, our security officers downstairs who were sitting looking at screens, what was going on in the house, had a shock. There was Boris Yeltsin dressed in the smallest bikini with everything hanging out, and a lot of it hanging out, and he had taken the wrong turn from his bathroom, gone to the emergency door, gone down a very dangerous staircase and came and stood down at the staircase. They had cameras on him and was trying to get into the neighboring building. And of course it gave an enormous screech, you know, the building, and he nearly jumped out of these tiny towers. And then my people were sitting there, my God, they had better call Secret Service because it was Secret Service responsibility in the house. And while they were calling Secret Service, they had another shock because there's Boris Yeltsin standing in their door and sort of, dead drunk, standing like this and saying nothing, just bowing to them. And then he rolled around the corner into what we call the Leslie Coffeld room. And that was named for the security guard who defended Truman and who died in defending Truman 1st of November 1950 when the Puerto Ricans tried to assassinate him. And we have this room set aside for the uniformed police and the Capitol Police and everybody who's out having late night service. They can come in for coffee and tea and goodies from the kitchen and so on. There were 30 policemen sitting in the room. There's Boris Yeltsin standing in the door. And then I was told later, one of these policemen said, "Oh my God, here's a drunk Russian in the door." His boss said, "Oh no, that's Boris Yeltsin." and the next day, he went to the White House for the official welcome with sun coming down. He was standing there with no sunglasses on, and people said, we were watching it on television at Blair House, and they were saying, "Oh, the poor man, somebody should have given him sunglasses." And my deputy and I looked at each other. We knew he was just having the mother of all hangovers.
Well, in a way, you know, I think maybe it would be better to have Yeltsin, alcohol and all, rather than our friend Putin at this point.
I avoided Putin, thank God.
Before your time. Well, first, can I ask you how much time we have? Because there's a couple of questions I want to ask Mrs. V about herself, but...
We have about 15 minutes,
Oh.
but we can go over if you like.
No, well, let me just ask you one question about yourself, because what I see in reading your book all the time is when you see something that you want, you go after it, and you get it. And you're successful, and you did the same thing for your deputy. When you decided to leave, you wrote 50 letters recommending him so that he would get the job and not a political appointee, because everybody wants this job. And so I think that's just marvelous. But here's the question. What do you recommend to young people like our interns in the back about character, about one or two things that you would recommend to be successful? What do you need to do?
If I can go back a moment, I did not know that I wanted Blair House. I did not go after it. I have to say it fell in my lap because I didn't know really, I didn't pay attention to what it was. I just needed to get out of the senator's office. I needed to get away from the water problems of the village of Magdalena down near Socorro. And I dealt entirely with the state, and I'd done it for 6.5 years, and I needed to get back in the international world, and my fit was not right for the World Bank or International Monetary Fund or something like that. And then a friend of mine who was stationed in Korea with US aid, Neb Bashik, called me at midnight one night and said that his wife would not forgive him when he came back to Korea if he hadn't checked on me, how was I? And I said, I'm sick and tired of my job, I need to get out. Oh, he said, a good friend of mine I have served with is the recruiting officer in State Department. And he said, let me have him call you. He called, John St. Dennis called me the next day and asked me to come in to meet with him. And after he had sort of heard about my wildlife, I had lived in Cyprus, Scotland, Switzerland, Iran, Mexico, done strange things in my life. He said, you belong in protocol office. I said, fine, sounds good to me. Literally, that's what I said. I didn't really focus on, as long as I could get out of the Senate and stay in government. And then he called down to Blair, to the protocol office. And the executive director there, the minute he heard of my hotel background, said Blair House. And they were looking, they had been looking for months during the hiatus of Blair House for somebody. And that's sort of how I ended up there. I never consciously, I wouldn't know what I went for. My mother knew more about Blair House sitting in Copenhagen than I did. And so it was just such luck and maybe right timing. And the ambassador, the chief of protocol, Ambassador Roosevelt, who hired me, always said it was luck. It was fate, she said, that brought you to me. And I think in a way it was fate for me too, that just the right time, the right job and all of that. Now what would I say to young people today? I think you have to follow your passions. You have to find out what interests you in life and can you make a career out of that. That's what I would. And my career was, I was trained in hotel business. From I was a little girl, I opened doors for my parents' friends. I took the coats. When I was 9 years old, I graduated to serving food at the table. And they had a free waitress on the premises until my father kissed my cheek when I served him. And I went out to the kitchen and tore off my apron because the men wouldn't leave me alone, so I didn't want to do this anymore. But anyway, I learned from home. I loved the give and take and the flow of people and things like that. And therefore, when my father got posted to Washington, that was the biggest blessing of any I could have had. And I was permitted to become an immigrant. And I need to tell you who are all, most of you are born here, I think. How many immigrants are here in the room? Yes, Jessica. I cannot tell you enough about the privilege that America confers upon people by giving them immigration visas, to allow somebody like me to come into the country and make and work for the Americans, to be welcomed with open arms, to have a chance at making the kind of life that perhaps I could envision for myself. It's absolutely priceless. Yes. I think, Jessica, you join me in that, don't you, in that sentiment?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I know. It's absolutely unbelievable. And so I would say, and also because hotel business was my passion, but then out here in New Mexico, I somehow, through friendships, got into the political world, working for the Republican minority leader and a whip in the House for 5 years. And that was for me another enormous experience, because it showed me democracy in action. And you had people from all over the state who had access to their legislators and could bring their problems and would be listened to. They may not prevail because money speaks louder than the environment and conservation and so on, but they had an ear, they could visit and so on, and it was absolutely wonderful. And that was an eye-opener for a new citizen. And then, of course, after my happy, friendly divorce from my very dear friend and ex-husband, I went back to Washington and worked for Senator Valentiner for 7 years. And then, of course, Bill Clinton, when I saw them in action at Blair House, it was also another eye-opener, because first and foremost, they loved Blair House. And Bill Clinton came over as often as he could and brought his cabinet meetings over to Blair House with practically 10 minutes warning, can you get us a sandwich? Of course, it's Blair House, you know, what do you expect? We can do anything. But he loved it, and I saw those two people in action, and my impression of them was that for them, everybody has value. And that is what I really loved seeing, that it didn't matter if you were green or black or brown or walked on your hands or whatever, you had something to contribute, you had value. And that for me was very important. And then to get back to the question, what would I can only say, follow your passion, follow what is wonderful for you to do, what makes you happy to go to work in the morning and so on, and somehow the rest might fall in place. And perhaps forget about, I have always been in a career where money was much less than it should have been. In the public service you don't exactly end up a millionaire, but I loved what I did. And I think when you think of spending your entire life having to work, you have to love what you're doing. And I think that's more important than the big money and the 2 cars and the 3 houses and things like that. So,
well said. Okay, I think we're on to questions.
And if you can speak loudly, and then if you wouldn't mind repeating the questions for the group, that would be great. Do you want to go towards the back? Yes, please.
This is kind of a personal question. In your years doing what you were doing, was there ever a time when you were willing, all close to giving your heart away to someone who was just sweeping you away?
In the position that you want to give your heart away and sweep it away.
oh God, no.
Maybe we should leave it there, right? We have questions. Do you want to comment?
I was fascinated by your letter recently in the paper about Queen Elizabeth and her visit. And one sees pictures of Buckingham Palace, and it's really quite extraordinary and quite grand. Yet you said in your piece that the staff for Queen Elizabeth said that compared with Blair House, Buckingham Palace was a
Cabbage and potatoes.
cabbage and potatoes place, and I was wondering if you would tell us what exactly that means. Put some flesh on the bones of that
Okay,
comment.
I'll put flesh on the bones, include some excellent brandy that goes with the coffee after dinner for the valet and the dresser and all these people. That it was the two ladies in waiting, Lady Airlie, His Grace, the Earl of Airlie, who was her Lord Chamberlain. She was the #1 lady in waiting. She was American, and it was Mrs. Stockdale. And they told me that it was like a lap, to be in the lap of luxury, to be at Blair House, because we pampered them. They had superb food. We really had a wonderful kitchen, and everything, they just lifted a little hand, needed something washed or ironed or whatever, and it was done, and they couldn't believe it. Buckingham Palace, I believe, is run by the government. It's not run by her personal people, and it's the same with the Queen Margrethe of Denmark. Her place is also run by civil servants, and so I think they don't perhaps care as much. I think they just felt they were being spoiled like anything. And of course they were en route to Britannia, HMS Britannia, where the quarters are tiny and very simple. I've seen it in Edinburgh, and even the Queen's stateroom is nothing, frankly, compared to Blair House, it's nothing. And so I think it's just a little more primitive, and we felt kind of good about that, as you think about it. And the same with the, when I sent the article, I didn't elaborate a lot on it, but we had laid the most beautiful table for the two of them up in the library. That was their first night at Blair House, the only night they would have dinner, and they had ordered trout, we laid the most beautiful table. I made pink and peach roses and peonies, and we had the old silver candelabras out on the table and so on. And when I came up with my flowers about 20 minutes before they were coming back, I saw that the candelabras had been removed from the table. So I went to find the page called Nicholas. He was the personal assistant. And of course, there again, the luxury at Blair House, he was finishing off his lavish dinner with 3 kinds of wine, and he didn't get that at Buckingham Palace, I can tell you. But I said, Nicholas, I see you have moved the candlesticks. Does Her Majesty not like candlelight? Oh no, we love it, he said. But he pointed to our $1 a piece, what do you call them? Votive candles that we had on the staff dining room table. He said, we so much prefer these because we use them at Balmoral. And so what could I do? We brought up little votive candles, and that's where I think, and I didn't say that in the article, I always sort of pictured them afterwards, curled up in a chair after dinner, and then of course that image doesn't last very long. These people are different in every way, but anyway, did it answer it, Pam?
Thank you.
Okay.
And the gentleman next to you?
Thank you for your remarks and your anecdotes tonight. Which of today's current leaders and statespeople would you have liked to have entertained at the Blair House, and why?
Oh God. Do we have any? Seriously, do we have any leaders? Obama, of course, yes, but and he was special, and of course Biden. I love Biden too.
Oh, but we have to talk about Mandela. I almost so you can talk.
But he's not allowed. But to answer you here, just to go to Obama and Biden, whom I would have loved to have met there, it is tradition that the president-elect can request the use of Blair House if, for instance, like Clinton, he lived in Arkansas, when he comes to Washington to arrange his government and so on. And that was our chance to meet them. So if Obama had come when I was there, I would have had a chance to meet Obama and his wife at a level which would be the two of us, you know, not with 1,000 people in between, which happens later on. But I can't really. And Angela Merkel, I would have liked to have seen. I didn't see her. I had other Germans there. I admire her, and it's also wishy-washy now compared to what it was. You know,
Do say a word about Mandela.
Yeah. Okay, Mandela was my other most favorite visitor, as you can imagine. And I remember Papa Bush invited de Klerk of South Africa for a visit, the first one in 40 years from South Africa, after he freed Mandela. And then de Klerk was welcome to come to Washington. And that was a very special visit too, because he was quite an humble character and was talking about for sure I shall not be re-elected because I have freed Mandela, you know, things like that. Mandela came 5 months after he became president, and when it was announced in Washington, the atmosphere, I swear, was electric. You could, I mean, it was sort of, were you there at the time, Mark? No. It was completely electric, and people were so excited, and there were so many in the community, in the African American community, that had worked so hard on getting rid of apartheid. And I think the Sullivan principle, isn't that the principle where you should not deal with South Africa until it happens in trade and so on. Yeah. And it was just absolutely incredible. And he came, he was delightful. And he was handsome, tall, gorgeous, lovely to everybody. And I was told ahead of time that the Secret Service had told me that he walked very badly. He had been, you know, busted up in all kinds of ways, and that he hated elevators for obvious reasons. He had been locked up in a tiny little room for 26 years. But when he arrived, the Secret Service said, no, we must take him. We took him in the basement entrance, and we must take him up in an elevator because he doesn't walk so well. And I went up with him and his Secret Service, and just the three of us in a very small space, and I could see how uncomfortable he was. And he told me, he said, I don't like it because I was shut up for a long time. Yes. But he was absolutely wonderful. We have certain instructions as to what he ate, and also that he was so happy to meet everybody, but he would not shake hands because his hands had been damaged from his hard work. And also we could take photographs but not use flash because his eyes had been hurt very much from this. But other than that, he was just unbelievable, and his goodbye was almost as big as the Queen Elizabeth was, with so many people wanting to come and see him. Now, when he came back about 18 months later, and he had newly married, he had remarried Kasia Michelle, who was the widow of the president who was shot out of the air in Mozambique, wasn't it? Yeah. And he was so happy, and he came on a lesser visit. One was to get the Congressional Medal of Honor, but after Blair House, he went to Harvard, and I get goosebumps when I think of it. He is only the third person in the history of Harvard University who has been given an honorary degree in a ceremony dedicated to him alone. The the other two were George Washington and Winston Churchill. I have goosebumps every time I think about this. He was just lovely. He was also tough, and he was so upset, we could hear, and he had been so upset at his staff meeting because of all these women who were trying to boss him around. And the other thing he did, which I really loved, President Clinton, because Aristide of Haiti, shortly before he was reinstalled as president of Haiti, after waiting, 3 years or something like that, Aristide was still in Washington, and Mr. Clinton had asked Mr. Mandela if he would meet with him for half an hour because he thought it would be an influential thing to do.
Sure.
Aristide was half an hour late. And I love this. Mandela came out and said, "You're half an hour late, you have to come back at another time," and he walked him out in the street. I was just standing there, and Mandela's chief of staff came up the stairs, and I said to him, "Well done," and he just rubbed his hands and said, "Don't mess with us." I really love that. But you know, when you think of what this man went through,
Sure.
the way he had been treated, the way his life had been thrown out, he was gracious beyond everything. Have you met him, Mark?
No, unfortunately not.
Oh, I was overwhelmed by that, yeah.
Yes, Aristide would have been very intimidated. So is there a last question, which is Mark?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for this tonight. But I really want to say, we are so indebted to you as a country, Benedict, that you chose to be an American, for your service to our country and everything that you've done. So I really say that from the heart. Thank you so much. But I do.
Interviewing you is such a pleasure.
He does have a question.
But I do have a question. In looking at the slides, I see that so many rooms were named after Robert E. Lee. And of course, after, Black Lives Matter, monuments have come down, and the view of Robert E. Lee is very different. And I guess my question is, if you were still at Blair House, would you be comfortable having a room named after Robert E. Lee?
Actually, it's not named after him. He hangs in the Lincoln Room. And so, but I also feel that it's historic. It's our history.
I see.
And if we don't like the history, tough, it's whichever way we look at it and so on.
Sure.
And in the Lincoln Room, where the portrait of Lee is hanging, it was the office of the Blair family, and they were very close to President Lincoln, and they helped President Lincoln to power. And therefore, they were asked to summon Colonel Lee to Blair House. And at Blair House, 3 days before the attack on Fort Sumter, he was offered command of the American Army, of the US Army. And he turned it down, and within a few days had resigned his commission and joined the Confederacy, thereby making the Civil War much longer. And it is a very historic room.
Yes.
And it's also, I will just say about the Blairs, if I may, Mr. Blair had, his oldest son was Montgomery Blair. And those of you who know Washington, D.C., there's Montgomery County out in Maryland, there's Silver Springs, which was the estate of Mr. Blair, while he rented Blair House to various people. And Tecumseh Sherman was married at Blair House because he married the daughter of the Interior Secretary who rented Blair House for a while. And so there are all kinds of things, that has happened there. And I think having the Lee portrait is just a piece of history that belongs to Blair House. That's my feeling. Of course, President Truman was the one who, in a way, is mostly associated with Blair House. In the old days, when the Blair and the Lee house were the only two houses there, the white and the red one to the left of the white one, he lived in Blair House when FDR died for 3 months to give Mrs. Roosevelt time to get out of the White House. And then when they moved over to the White House, and Margaret Truman's piano went through the floor, they realized that sooner or later a president had to move out and have the whole house redone. And so they moved back to Blair House. And Blair House, they lived at Blair House longer than they ever did at the White House. And so in the Lee dining room, and you may have remembered the picture of President Clinton at the end of the table with King Hussein and Prime Minister Bean, that was his cabinet room, and that is the table he used in there. And that is where he played poker in that room. He decided to send troops to Korea, and that is where the Marshall Plan was created. And for a European, the Marshall Plan is this sort of incredible thing out there. And what was so interesting for me was when we had the Bulgarians coming, for instance, the Bulgarian president was invited by Papa Bush to come, and he came with everybody except one minister he left behind to run the country. Everybody else came and stayed with us. And they had originally decided not to have any dinner at Blair House. They were going out in the town to restaurants, and I persuaded the advance team, please have one meal in that room, one dinner, because I'm making history. I'm continuing the history of Blair House. And I told them what had happened in that room, that the Marshall Plan had been written there. They had tears in their eyes when they came out from dinner, that they had had dinner in that room, although the Marshall Plan did not help them in any way. They could look across the border, they could see what the Marshall Plan did for Europe after the Second World War, and so for them it was incredible. That's another of those things that made all these long hours and sore feet and all of that worthwhile when you can experience that, I think.
I just don't know how Blair House ever replaced you. Thank you so much.
It's been delightful and an inspiration, and I know that I suspect I'm not alone in saying that we could listen till midnight to her stories. I'm going to ask Benedicte to sit right here, and if you would like to buy a book or have yours signed, that she do it here instead of outside because it's dark, or over there, I'm being told, or over at the back of the room. Oh, there's your books. I see them right there. So we will wait for you all to go there, and we'll bring Benedicte. Thank you so much for coming, giving us your time and attention.
Stop. No, it's still on there. I'm just saying, finish it.